Mental weakness is rarely attacked head-on. It is not confronted, debated, or corrected with warnings. Instead, it is quietly punished. Opportunities stop arriving. Access narrows. Respect evaporates without explanation. This is the first reality behind the ruthless laws that destroy the weakest parts of your mind. Weakness is not something society tries to fix. It is something systems slowly remove. Most people believe weakness invites help. In reality, it invites distance. When a mind leaks emotion, seeks reassurance, or reacts predictably, it signals instability. And instability is not corrected inside competitive systems. It is filtered out. This is not cruelty. It is efficiency. Systems do not pause to educate fragile minds. They simply move around them. This is exactly why the destruction of mental weakness feels confusing. There is no confrontation moment, no clear rejection, no explanation. Just silence, delay, replacement. The mind expects feedback. The world offers absence. And that absence is the punishment. The core misunderstanding is moral. Weakness feels like something that should be met with compassion. But these laws are not moral. They are mechanical. They operate whether you understand them or not. The weakest parts of the mind are destroyed not because they are wrong, but because they are costly. They slow decisions. They introduce emotional volatility. They make outcomes unpredictable. This is why the ruthless laws that destroy the weakest parts of your mind are never announced. Announcing them would defeat their purpose. A system that explains itself invites negotiation. And negotiation is a weakness systems cannot afford. Consider how this shows up in everyday life. The emotionally reactive employee is not fired immediately. They are simply stopped being considered. The over-explainer is not argued with. They are no longer trusted with authority. The validation seeker is not shamed. They are quietly excluded from serious decisions. Nothing dramatic happens, and that is precisely the point. Weak minds expect resistance. Strong systems use removal. What makes this especially dangerous is that weakness is often invisible to the person experiencing it. The mind interprets silence as neutrality. It assumes things are fine. But silence is rarely neutral. Silence is often assessment. It is the space where a system decides whether you are worth the cost of engagement. This is the first ruthless law at work. Mental weakness is not challenged. It is bypassed. Throughout this documentary, every law you will encounter explains a different way the mind betrays itself under pressure. Emotional leakage, over-explanation, validation hunger, predictability, moral exposure, replaceability, self-betrayal. None of these are moral failures. They are signals, and signals invite responses. The mistake weak minds make is believing intention matters more than impact. They believe being good, honest, or hardworking should protect them. But systems do not respond to intention. They respond to behavioral reliability. A calm, contained mind signals safety. A reactive mind signals risk. And risk is always reduced, never accommodated. This is why the destruction feels unfair, because it is not personal. The laws do not care who you are. They only respond to how you operate. When people say, "I don't know what I did wrong," they are usually correct. They didn't do anything wrong. They did something revealing. And revelation is what these ruthless laws punish most severely. The purpose of this documentary is not to glorify this process. It is to expose it. Because once you see how the ruthless laws that destroy the weakest parts of your mind operate, you stop waiting for warnings that will never come. You stop mistaking silence for safety, and you begin to understand that strength is not loud, moral, or impressive. Strength is contained. Strength is unreadable. Strength does not demand reassurance. In the sections that follow, we will dismantle each law one by one, not to teach manipulation, but to build recognition. Because the only real defense against these laws is awareness. You cannot negotiate with them. You cannot appeal to them. You can only stop triggering them. And that begins by understanding why weakness is never confronted, only erased. When people hear the word weakness, They imagine incompetence, low intelligence, or lack of effort. That misunderstanding is itself a form of vulnerability, because the ruthless laws that destroy the weakest parts of your mind do not target stupidity. They target instability. Weakness, in psychological terms, is not about what you know. It is about how predictable your inner state becomes under pressure. A highly intelligent mind can still be weak. A disciplined worker can still be weak. A morally upright person can still be weak. What matters is whether the mind leaks information, seeks external regulation, or collapses when conditions shift. These are the traits that trigger destruction, not ignorance. The first core component of weakness is emotional leakage. This is the inability to contain internal reactions. Frustration shows on the face. Anxiety alters tone. Excitement overrides judgment. The mind broadcasts its state before it has decided what that state should mean. In psychological systems, this is catastrophic. Emotional leakage gives observers data they did not earn. And unearned data creates leverage. This is why emotionally expressive people often believe they are being authentic, while systems experience them as unreliable. Authenticity feels virtuous. Predictability is costly. The ruthless laws that destroy the weakest parts of your mind respond to cost, not virtue. The second component is validation dependence. A weak mind cannot self-stabilize. It requires feedback to confirm direction, worth, or safety. Praise regulates mood. Silence destabilizes it. Criticism lingers longer than it should. This creates a psychological tether. Wherever validation comes from, power follows. Systems quickly detect this. They sense who needs reassurance and who does not, and they adjust accordingly. The one who needs validation is easier to guide, easier to placate, easier to replace. Not because they lack skill, but because their mind does not close its own circuits. Another overlooked component is over-explanation. Weak minds narrate themselves. They justify choices before being challenged. They clarify motives that were never questioned. This is not communication, it is anxiety management. The mind attempts to preempt rejection by flooding the environment with reasoning. But reasoning offered too early signals doubt, and doubt erodes authority faster than error. The ruthless laws that destroy the weakest parts of your mind treat over-explanation as a confession of insecurity. The listener does not hear clarity. They hear fear of misinterpretation. Weakness also appears as predictable morality. This is not about ethics, it is about exposure. When a mind loudly announces what it will never do, it unintentionally defines what it can be pressured into. Moral predictability becomes a handle. The mind believes it is demonstrating integrity. The system reads constraint. This is why moral people are often shocked when they are exploited. They mistake goodness for protection, but these laws do not reward goodness. They reward containment. A contained mind may be ethical, but it does not advertise the limits of its behavior. Another key trait is reactive identity. The weak mind defines itself through opposition. What it hates, what it fears, what it resents. This keeps it externally anchored. Every provocation pulls it off-center. Instead of choosing responses, it performs them, and performance is observable. Observe how often weak minds say, "That's just how I am." This is not self-knowledge. It is surrender. Fixed reactions eliminate strategic flexibility, and flexibility is survival. Perhaps the most dangerous form of weakness is self-betrayal under pressure. When a mind consistently compromises its boundaries to avoid loss, approval, security, belonging, it trains others to expect that surrender. Over time, the mind loses credibility with itself, and once that happens, every decision becomes negotiable. This is why weakness accelerates. Each small concession lowers the cost of the next one. The ruthless laws that destroy the weakest parts of your mind do not intervene. They allow the process to continue until the mind is no longer trusted with responsibility. Notice what all these traits share. They are not immoral. They are not malicious. They are leaky. They reveal internal states, boundaries, and fears prematurely, and revelation is the raw material of control. Strong minds are not colder, they are quieter internally. They experience emotion without broadcasting it. They hold values without advertising them. They decide without narrating the decision process. This does not make them superior people. It makes them lower cost to deal with. That is the uncomfortable truth beneath this documentary's title. The weakest parts of your mind are not destroyed because they are wrong, but because they are expensive. Understanding this reframes everything. You stop asking, "Why wasn't I warned?" and start asking, "What did I reveal without realizing it?" You stop assuming fairness governs outcomes. You start recognizing patterns. If the ruthless laws that destroy the weakest parts of your mind feel harsh, it is because they were never designed to feel humane. They were designed to select, to filter, to reduce risk, and to do so without explanation. These laws exist because environments, whether social, professional, or relational, are under constant pressure to function. They cannot afford prolonged instability. A mind that hesitates excessively, reacts emotionally, or depends on reassurance introduces friction. And friction is not corrected through empathy at scale. It is corrected through exclusion. This is the first principle to understand. These laws are not created by villains. They emerge from systems optimizing themselves. In evolutionary terms, groups that tolerated unpredictable behavior collapsed faster than groups that filtered it out. The same pattern repeats in modern settings. Companies, institutions, and even informal social circles reward psychological efficiency, not kindness, not fairness, efficiency. This is why the destruction of mental weakness is rarely dramatic. Drama attracts attention. Attention consumes energy. The most efficient response is silent adjustment, less access, fewer opportunities, slower replies. The weak mind interprets this as coincidence. The system experiences it as problem-solving. This is exactly how the ruthless laws that destroy the weakest parts of your mind operate, invisibly and continuously. Another reason these laws exist is asymmetry of information. When a mind leaks emotion, over-explains, or broadcasts values, it creates imbalance. One side reveals, the other observes. Over time, observation becomes leverage. Leverage becomes control, and control reshapes outcomes without confrontation. Systems learn quickly who reveals and who does not, and they adjust their behavior accordingly. The mind that reveals is managed. The mind that contains is negotiated with. Importantly, these laws do not require malice. No one needs to consciously decide to sideline someone. The process is often subconscious. Trust drifts, confidence fades. Responsibility reallocates. The weak mind is not attacked, it is outgrown. This is why appeals to fairness fail. Fairness assumes intention. These laws operate on pattern recognition. They respond to repeated signals, not moral arguments. A system does not ask, "Is this person good?" It asks, "Is this person stable?" Stability in this context means emotional containment, decision integrity, and behavioral consistency under stress. Not perfection, not dominance, containment. The ruthless aspect of these laws lies in their indifference. They do not care how much effort you invested. They do not care how sincere you are. They do not care how unfair the outcome feels. They respond only to what is demonstrated over time. This is why intelligent, hardworking people are often the most confused victims. They assume competence compensates for psychological leakage. It does not. Skill can earn entry. Only stability earns retention. Another reason these laws persist is scalability. Systems cannot personalize protection. They cannot monitor emotional nuance for every individual, so they rely on shortcuts, signals that reliably predict cost. Emotional volatility, over-justification, validation hunger, predictability. These traits are easy to detect, and once detected, they trigger distancing. Notice how none of this requires cruelty. No one has to intend harm. The laws simply express what happens when large structures interact with human psychology. This is also why weak minds often feel betrayed. They expected loyalty, but loyalty requires investment. And investment requires confidence in stability. When stability erodes, loyalty dissolves quietly, not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. The most uncomfortable truth is this: these laws protect the system more than they harm the individual. And because systems prioritize survival, the laws endure. Understanding why these laws exist reframes the rest of this documentary. The goal is not to fight them. That is impossible. The goal is to stop feeding them. When you realize the ruthless laws that destroy the weakest parts of your mind are automatic, not personal, you stop internalizing outcomes as moral judgments. You stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start asking, "What signal did I send repeatedly?" That shift is the beginning of strength. Not aggression, not manipulation, awareness. From this point forward, the documentary moves from why these laws exist to how they operate. Each law we examine next targets a specific weakness and shows how it leads to quiet erosion of respect, access, and influence. The first ruthless law that destroys the weakest parts of your mind is the law of emotional leakage. It operates quietly, constantly, and without forgiveness. Emotional leakage is not about feeling emotion. It is about revealing it before it has been processed. And unprocessed emotion is interpreted by systems as instability. Every environment is scanning for reliability. Emotional leakage interferes with that scan. A raised voice, defensive posture, visible frustration, excessive excitement, or wounded silence all communicate the same message. This mind reacts faster than it decides. That single signal is enough to begin erosion. This is why emotional people are not corrected. They are contained. Their influence narrows. Their responsibilities shrink. Their access becomes conditional. No confrontation is necessary. The system simply stops trusting their internal state to remain consistent under pressure. The dangerous misunderstanding is believing emotion equals honesty. Honesty feels virtuous, but these ruthless laws are not evaluating character, they are evaluating risk. A mind that broadcasts emotion reveals what moves it, and what moves you can be used against you, even unintentionally. This is exactly how the ruthless laws that destroy the weakest parts of your mind operate. They respond to exposure, not intent. Consider how emotional leakage plays out in professional settings. The person who visibly reacts to criticism becomes predictable. Others learn what triggers defensiveness. Over time, feedback is softened or withheld, not to protect feelings, but to avoid disruption. The individual is no longer trusted with unfiltered information. That is not kindness, it is downgrading. In relationships, emotional leakage creates a similar effect. Excessive reassurance seeking, visible insecurity, or emotional volatility shifts the dynamic. The other party begins managing rather than engaging. Attraction fades. Respect thins. Again, nothing dramatic happens. The system adjusts silently. The most deceptive part of emotional leakage is how justified it feels. Anyone would react. I'm just being real. I care deeply. But systems do not reward depth of feeling. They reward containment of response. Feeling is human. Display is strategic. Strong minds are not emotionless. They are emotionally sealed. They experience reaction internally, then decide what, if anything, should be expressed. This delay is not suppression. It is authority over impulse, and authority is the opposite of weakness. The law is ruthless because it compounds. The more often a mind leaks emotion, the more others expect it to. Expectations become strategies. Strategies become control. Eventually, the emotionally leaky individual feels manipulated, sidelined, or ignored without ever realizing they provided the leverage. This is why emotional leakage destroys from the inside. The mind believes it is being transparent. The world interprets it as uncontained. Notice how powerful figures behave under stress. They slow down. They reduce expression. Their faces reveal little. Their tone stays even. This is not affectation, it is protection. They understand that once emotion becomes visible, negotiation begins, and negotiation weakens position. The ruthless laws that destroy the weakest parts of your mind treat emotional containment as a prerequisite for seriousness. Without it, competence becomes irrelevant, talent becomes unstable, intelligence becomes noisy. The defensive insight here is simple but uncomfortable. Your emotion is yours to feel, not the environment's to read. The moment your internal state becomes publicly accessible, you surrender control over interpretation. Emotional leakage does not make you bad, it makes you legible. And legibility is what these laws punish first. This law does not demand suppression. It demands timing. Feel fully. Decide privately. Express selectively. Because the moment your emotions start deciding your exposure, the system has already begun deciding your limits. The second ruthless law that destroys the weakest parts of your mind is the law of over-explanation. This law is especially deceptive because it disguises itself as clarity, honesty, and good communication. In reality, over-explanation is rarely about being understood. It is about reducing anxiety. A mind that over-explains does not trust its position to stand on its own. It anticipates doubt before doubt exists. It answers objections before they are raised, and in doing so, it quietly signals uncertainty. Systems are extremely sensitive to this signal. When someone explains more than necessary, the listener does not think, "This person is thorough." They think, "This person is afraid of being questioned." And fear, no matter how intelligent or polite, reduces authority. This is exactly how the ruthless laws that destroy the weakest parts of your mind operate. They do not punish mistakes. They punish preemptive submission. Over-explanation is a form of psychological leakage. Instead of leaking emotion, the mind leaks reasoning. It exposes its internal decision process, its doubts, its justifications. What should remain internal becomes public. And once internal deliberation is visible, confidence collapses. This is why powerful individuals speak in fewer words, not more. Brevity signals certainty. It implies that the decision is already settled. Over-explanation implies that the decision is still negotiable. In professional environments, this law is brutal. The person who explains every choice trains others to challenge them. Not because the explanation invites debate, but because it signals that debate is possible. Over time, authority shifts away from the explainer toward the evaluator. Notice the pattern. The more someone explains, the more others interrupt. The more they justify, the more they are questioned. The more they clarify, the less they are trusted with final decisions. Nothing hostile occurs. The erosion is subtle, but it is relentless. In relationships, over-explanation has a similar effect. Excessive reassurance, constant clarification of intent, or repeated defense of harmless actions creates imbalance. One person begins to feel like the judge. The other becomes the defendant. Respect does not survive that structure. The weak mind believes explanation prevents misunderstanding. The system understands something else. Confidence does not need defense. This law is ruthless because it inverts effort. The more energy you invest in explaining, the less value your words carry. Explanation becomes noise. Silence becomes weight. And yet, over-explanation feels responsible. It feels mature. It feels considerate. That is why so many intelligent people fall into it. They mistake communication for security. But security comes from decision integrity, not narration. Strong minds allow space for misinterpretation. They do not rush to close every gap. They trust outcomes to correct misunderstandings. Weak minds rush to control perception, and perception control is exhausting. The ruthless laws that destroy the weakest parts of your mind interpret exhaustion as fragility. The deeper danger of over-explanation is internal. Each time the mind justifies itself unnecessarily, it reinforces doubt. It rehearses insecurity. It teaches itself that action alone is insufficient, that approval must follow. Over time, the mind loses decisiveness. Choices feel heavier. Expression becomes cautious. And eventually, silence from others feels threatening. The cycle tightens. The defensive insight here is not to become vague or evasive. It is to stop narrating your confidence. Say what needs to be said. Then stop. Let the environment react. Over-explanation does not make you clearer. It makes you smaller. And once the system senses that shrinkage, it responds exactly as these laws predict, by trusting you less, not more. The third ruthless law that destroys the weakest parts of your mind is the law of validation addiction. This law does not punish incompetence, it punishes dependence. Specifically, the dependence on external approval to stabilize your inner state. A mind addicted to validation cannot stand alone. Its confidence rises and falls based on feedback. Praise becomes fuel. Silence becomes threat. Criticism lingers longer than it should. This instability is subtle, but systems detect it quickly. The ruthless laws that destroy the weakest parts of your mind respond harshly to this pattern because dependence shifts power outward. Wherever validation comes from, control follows. This is why validation-seeking behavior is so costly. It makes your emotional equilibrium accessible to others. A delayed reply unsettles you. A neutral tone feels personal. A lack of recognition feels like rejection. None of these reactions are extreme, but together they reveal leverage points. Strong systems exploit leverage automatically, not out of malice, but out of efficiency. They invest more in minds that regulate themselves. They reduce investment in minds that require constant reassurance. This is why validation addiction leads to quiet exclusion. The individual is not criticized. They are simply stopped being centered. Their ideas are acknowledged politely, then bypassed. Their presence is tolerated, but not relied upon. In work environments, validation-addicted minds often confuse visibility with value. They seek recognition instead of results. They need affirmation after effort, not outcome. Over time, this creates noise, and noise is filtered out. In relationships, the pattern is even clearer. Excessive need for reassurance shifts the dynamic from mutuality to management. One person begins maintaining the other's emotional state. Attraction fades, respect erodes. Not because care disappears, but because self-regulation is missing. This law is ruthless because it operates invisibly. No one announces, "You seek too much approval." Instead, response is slow. Feedback becomes generic. Engagement thins. The validation addict feels something is wrong, but cannot locate the cause. The misunderstanding lies in believing that wanting validation is human, therefore harmless. It is human, but harmlessness is not the metric these laws use. They measure cost. A mind that cannot self-stabilize introduces emotional overhead. Systems reduce overhead. This is exactly how the ruthless laws that destroy the weakest parts of your mind function. They move away from instability without explanation. Powerful figures rarely seek praise publicly. When recognition comes, it is accepted calmly. When it does not, nothing changes. This emotional independence is not arrogance, it is insulation. It prevents others from steering the mind indirectly. The most dangerous aspect of validation addiction is how it shapes behavior. Decisions begin catering to approval rather than outcome. Opinions soften, boundaries blur. Over time, the mind betrays its own standards to maintain acceptance. This is not morality, it is fear management. Once fear enters decision-making, credibility weakens. And credibility, once lost, is not argued back into existence. The defensive insight here is awareness, not suppression. Wanting approval is natural, needing it is structural weakness. The moment your sense of worth depends on external confirmation, you have outsourced your center. The ruthless laws that destroy the weakest parts of your mind treat outsourced centers as liabilities. They do not punish them loudly. They simply stop building around them. Strength, in this context, means being psychologically complete before the environment responds. Because the moment validation becomes oxygen, silence becomes suffocation, and the system notices. The fourth ruthless law that destroys the weakest parts of your mind is the law of predictability. This law operates on a simple principle. What can be predicted can be managed, and what can be managed is never respected. Predictability is not about routine, it is about reaction. A predictable mind responds the same way under similar pressure. It reveals its patterns early, and once those patterns are learned, the environment adjusts around them. This is why predictability is treated as weakness by systems. It removes uncertainty, and uncertainty is where power lies. The ruthless laws that destroy the weakest parts of your mind respond to repeated behavior, not stated intention. When your reactions become reliable, others stop engaging with you as an equal. They begin anticipating you. Anticipation replaces negotiation. Consider how this unfolds. The person who always defends themselves becomes the one others provoke. The person who always appeases becomes the one others lean on. The person who always explodes becomes the one others avoid or quietly manipulate. Nothing aggressive is required. The environment simply adapts. Predictability creates psychological grooves. Each repeated reaction deepens the groove until it becomes identity. That's just how they are. And once a mind is reduced to a known pattern, it stops being taken seriously. This is why predictability accelerates replacement. Systems prefer variables they cannot fully model. They invest in minds that retain optionality. A predictable mind offers no strategic surprise. It offers convenience, and convenience is easy to substitute. The weak mind often confuses consistency with reliability. But reliability is about outcomes, not emotional habits. Consistently reacting is not the same as consistently delivering. This law becomes especially destructive under stress. When pressure rises, predictable minds collapse in familiar ways. Anxiety spikes. Defensiveness appears. Withdrawal sets in. Observers do not feel empathy, they feel confirmation. The pattern has repeated. The signal is complete. The ruthless laws that destroy the weakest parts of your mind reward behavioral ambiguity, not deception, but range. The ability to pause, to choose different responses under identical conditions, to remain unreadable long enough to decide. Powerful individuals are rarely unpredictable in values, but they are unpredictable in reaction. They do not allow others to prescript interactions. This keeps leverage distributed. Predictable minds, by contrast, negotiate against themselves. Others know how much pressure to apply, how long to wait, when to provoke, when to ignore. Control emerges without force. The most dangerous part of predictability is how innocent it feels. I'm just being myself. But the self that cannot adapt becomes a liability. Adaptation is not dishonesty, it is survival. The defensive insight here is not chaos, it is interruption, interrupting automatic reactions, creating space between stimulus and response. When that space exists, predictability dissolves. The ruthless laws that destroy the weakest parts of your mind do not punish consistency. They punish rigidity. The moment your reactions become habits, your environment begins writing the script. And once that happens, the role you are given will never be the one with control. The fifth ruthless law that destroys the weakest parts of your mind is the law of moral exposure. This law targets a specific and deeply misunderstood weakness, the belief that openly displaying one's moral code creates protection. It does not. Moral exposure is not about having values. It is about broadcasting them. When a mind announces what it will always do or never do, it believes it is signaling integrity. In reality, it is advertising constraint. The ruthless laws that destroy the weakest parts of your mind treat constraint as opportunity. Systems do not respond to morality the way individuals do. They respond to predictable limits. Once those limits are known, pressure is applied just below them. Not enough to break you, just enough to use you. This is why moral people are often shocked by exploitation. They assumed goodness created safety. Instead, it created a map. Consider how moral exposure plays out. Someone loudly declares loyalty, honesty, or self-sacrifice. Over time, expectations form. They will stay late. They won't push back. They won't walk away. The system adjusts. Demands increase. Boundaries erode. Nothing malicious is required. The environment simply leans where it knows it can. The most dangerous form of moral exposure is performative. Announcing ethics publicly creates pressure to maintain image. The mind becomes trapped by its own declaration. It must now act consistently, not because it chooses to, but because deviation would cost identity. This removes flexibility, and flexibility is power. The ruthless laws that destroy the weakest parts of your mind punish exposed morality because it replaces discretion with obligation. Once obligation is visible, negotiation disappears. Others stop asking. They start assuming. Strong minds are ethical without being legible. Their values are internal, not performative. They act when they choose, not when pressured by their own statements. This makes them harder to corner. Notice how respected figures rarely announce their principles. They demonstrate them selectively. Their ethics emerge through behavior over time, not slogans. This keeps their decision space open. Weak minds believe transparency builds trust. Systems know that selective opacity preserves leverage. The irony is that moral exposure often begins as a defense. The mind wants to be seen as good, safe, trustworthy. But these laws do not protect goodness. They exploit predictability. This is why moral people are often overworked, undercredited, and quietly bypassed. Their refusal to break character makes them dependable, but disposable. The defensive insight here is not cynicism. It is containment. Values do not need witnesses to be real. Integrity does not require announcement. The ruthless laws that destroy the weakest parts of your mind are indifferent to virtue. They respond to visibility. Once your moral boundaries are public, they stop being boundaries and become handles, and anything with a handle can be pulled. The sixth ruthless law that destroys the weakest parts of your mind is the law of psychological replaceability. This law is often mistaken for a skills problem. It is not. Replaceability is rarely about competence. It is about emotional dependency and psychological footprint. A mind becomes replaceable when its absence creates no disturbance. Systems do not replace people who are psychologically expensive to lose. They replace people whose removal creates silence, not consequence. And that silence is not accidental. It is cultivated by weakness over time. The ruthless laws that destroy the weakest parts of your mind measure one thing above all else. What happens when this person is not here? If nothing changes, the verdict is already written. Psychological replaceability emerges when a mind becomes overly accommodating, emotionally compliant, and excessively available. These traits feel cooperative. In reality, they flatten impact. The individual adapts so well that the system no longer has to adapt to them. Adaptation without resistance removes leverage. This is why dependency accelerates disposability. The mind that needs the system more than the system needs the mind unconsciously signals imbalance. That imbalance invites substitution, not immediately, quietly. Watch how this law operates. Responsibilities are redistributed temporarily. Communication loops shorten. Decisions happen without consultation. The individual is still present, but no longer central. Replacement begins before removal. The weak mind often misreads this as trust. They don't need to check with me. In reality, they no longer feel the need to include you. The ruthless laws that destroy the weakest parts of your mind punish emotional attachment to position. The moment identity fuses with role, fear enters decision-making. Fear softens boundaries. Boundaries soften influence. This is why highly skilled people are still replaced. Skill earns entry. Psychological gravity earns permanence. Psychological gravity is created by independence of thought. emotional self-sufficiency, and the willingness to remain intact without constant inclusion. The mind that does not chase relevance becomes relevant. Replaceable minds chase reassurance. They say yes quickly. They stay agreeable. They avoid friction. Over time, they erase their own necessity. This law is especially ruthless because it feels invisible until it is complete. By the time replacement becomes obvious, the leverage window has already closed. The defensive insight here is not arrogance or withdrawal. It is self-contained presence, the ability to contribute without clinging, to matter without reminding, to stand without leaning. The ruthless laws that destroy the weakest parts of your mind do not punish cooperation. They punish psychological dependency. Once dependency is sensed, replacement is inevitable, not out of cruelty, but out of structural logic. And when replacement happens quietly, it is never reversed loudly. The seventh and final ruthless law that destroys the weakest parts of your mind is the law of self-betrayal. This law is the most destructive because it does not rely on external pressure. It is activated from within. By the time it takes effect, the other laws have already prepared the ground. Self-betrayal occurs when the mind repeatedly acts against its own internal signals to avoid loss. Loss of approval, safety, belonging, or status. Each compromise feels small, reasonable, temporary, but together they form a pattern that systems notice immediately. The ruthless laws that destroy the weakest parts of your mind interpret self-betrayal as the clearest signal of all. This mind can be negotiated downward. The weak mind does not collapse in a single moment. It erodes through justification. This isn't the right time. I'll address it later. It's not worth the conflict. Each delay teaches the environment the same lesson, that boundaries are flexible when pressure is applied gently. Over time, others stop testing whether you will protect your position. They already know you won't. This is why self-betrayal accelerates all other laws. Emotional leakage increases because frustration is suppressed rather than resolved. Over-explanation follows because confidence weakens. Validation addiction deepens because self-trust fades. Predictability hardens because fear narrows response options. Moral exposure becomes performative because values are no longer enforced internally. Self-betrayal is the quiet glue that binds weakness together. The most dangerous aspect of this law is how rational it feels. The mind frames surrender as maturity, as patience, as strategy. But strategy that costs self-respect is not strategy, it is avoidance. Systems are remarkably sensitive to this shift. The moment someone stops honoring their own signals, others feel permitted to do the same. Respect does not vanish suddenly. It thins, then it disappears. This is why people often say, "I don't recognize myself anymore." That recognition was traded away gradually, one concession at a time. The ruthless laws that destroy the weakest parts of your mind do not punish mistakes. They punish pattern surrender. A single compromise does nothing. Repeated compromise rewrites identity. Strong minds are not rigid. They adapt without abandoning themselves. They choose loss deliberately when necessary, but they do not pretend loss is victory. Weak minds reframe loss to avoid discomfort, and in doing so, lose credibility with themselves. Once self-credibility collapses, external credibility follows. This is the final law because it is the point of no return. A mind that consistently betrays itself becomes hollow. It performs strength without possessing it. At that stage, replacement, marginalization, or collapse is inevitable. The defensive insight here is clarity, not confrontation. Pay attention to the moments when you silence your own discomfort to preserve peace. Those moments are not harmless. They are instructional. They teach others how far you can be pushed. The ruthless laws that destroy the weakest parts of your mind end here, not with domination, but with absence. Absence of voice, absence of influence, absence of self-trust. Strength begins when self-betrayal ends, not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. Because the moment you stop negotiating against yourself, every other law loses its leverage. The most dangerous aspect of the ruthless laws that destroy the weakest parts of your mind is not their severity, it is their subtlety. They rarely announce themselves. They do not arrive with conflict or clear rejection. They appear as small shifts, delays, omissions. A change in tone that is easy to rationalize and hard to confront. This section exists for one purpose: recognition, because once these laws are visible, their power weakens. The first signal is shrinking access. You are no longer included early. Decisions are shared after they are finalized. Conversations you once shaped now happen elsewhere. Nothing explicit is said, but your proximity to influence has changed. This is often the earliest sign that emotional leakage, over-explanation, or validation dependence has been registered. Weak minds misinterpret shrinking access as coincidence. Strong minds treat it as data. The second signal is tone flattening. Responses become polite but empty. Praise becomes generic. Feedback becomes vague. When engagement loses texture, it usually means trust has thinned. The system is no longer investing emotionally or intellectually. It is managing distance. This is how the ruthless laws that destroy the weakest parts of your mind operate defensively. They reduce exposure before reducing presence. Another critical signal is predictable silence. Not all silence is dangerous, but patterned silence is. When messages are consistently delayed, when follow-ups are ignored but not rejected, when conversations stall without explanation, the system is testing how much friction you create when overlooked. Weak minds chase clarity. They over-explain. They seek reassurance. They accelerate their own downgrade. Strong minds pause. They observe whether silence resolves itself or stabilizes. Silence that stabilizes is a verdict. Watch for responsibility drift. Tasks you once owned begin to temporarily move elsewhere. Your input is requested less often. Authority erodes quietly before it is reassigned formally. This is psychological replaceability in motion. The key mistake here is trying to reassert relevance through effort. Effort does not counter these laws. Containment does. When you push harder emotionally, the system pulls away faster. Another signal is boundary testing. Requests arrive closer to your limits. Deadlines shorten. Expectations rise without negotiation. If you comply without resistance, the system learns where your floor is. If you hesitate, it observes how quickly you self-correct. These moments reveal whether self-betrayal is active. Notice also how conflict disappears. This seems positive, but it often isn't. When disagreement stops entirely, it can mean your opinion no longer matters. Systems argue with minds they still consider consequential. They avoid minds they have already categorized. This is why sudden peace can be more dangerous than tension. The ruthless laws that destroy the weakest parts of your mind also reveal themselves internally. Pay attention to how you feel before interactions. Do you rehearse explanations? Anticipate objections. Soften your stance preemptively. These are signs that authority has already shifted. Another internal signal is delayed resentment. You agree in the moment, then replay the decision later with discomfort. This is self-betrayal registering after the fact. The mind knew the boundary, it just didn't enforce it. When this becomes habitual, others sense it, even if they cannot articulate how. Recognition also involves noticing who is no longer challenged. If people stop pushing back against you, it may feel like respect, but often it is resignation. They are no longer invested enough to engage fully. The defensive posture here is not confrontation, it is recalibration. Strong minds respond to these signals by reducing emotional output, not increasing it. They stop narrating, they slow reactions. They re-establish internal alignment before attempting external correction. This is critical. Once these laws are active, explanation accelerates damage. Recognition must precede response. The purpose of this section is not paranoia. Not every silence is betrayal. Not every delay is rejection. The difference lies in pattern. One-off changes mean nothing. Repeated shifts mean everything. The ruthless laws that destroy the weakest parts of your mind do not punish ignorance. They punish unawareness over time. When you can recognize these laws in motion, you stop being surprised by outcomes. Surprise is the tax paid by those who believe systems will warn them. They will not. Recognition does not guarantee control, but it restores choice, and choice is the foundation of strength. By the time you reach the end of this documentary, one truth should be unmistakable. The ruthless laws that destroy the weakest parts of your mind are not punishments. They are filters. They do not exist to harm you. They exist to reveal what you allow to remain uncontained. Cruelty implies intent. These laws have none. They do not wake up and decide who deserves dignity. They respond automatically to what is exposed, dependent, or unstable. Once this is understood, the emotional weight of the experience shifts. What once felt like betrayal begins to look like structure. This is why clarity, not resentment, is the final outcome of understanding these laws. Weakness was never attacked. It was simply no longer protected. Throughout this documentary, each law pointed to the same underlying principle. Containment precedes respect. Emotional containment. Cognitive containment. Moral containment. Identity containment. When the mind leaks, systems step back. When the mind stabilizes, systems lean in. The dangerous myth is that awareness of these laws makes someone manipulative or cold. In reality, awareness makes you less reactive, not more controlling. It removes the illusion that expression equals power and replaces it with understanding. Understanding how emotional leakage erodes trust does not require you to suppress emotion. It requires you to master timing. Understanding how over-explanation weakens authority does not demand silence, it demands decisiveness. Understanding validation addiction does not eliminate connection, it restores internal stability. These are not lessons in domination, they are lessons in self-governance. The reason these laws feel ruthless is because they contradict comforting narratives. They reject the idea that effort guarantees outcome. They dismantle the belief that goodness ensures safety. They expose the gap between intention and impact, but they also offer relief. Once you see how the weakest parts of your mind were being quietly destroyed, you stop personalizing outcomes. You stop searching for villains. You stop waiting for apologies or explanations that will never come. You begin paying attention to signals instead. The mind becomes quieter, more deliberate, less eager to perform, less desperate to be seen as good, right, or agreeable. This quiet is not emptiness, it is capacity. The strongest minds are not the loudest. They are not the most moral. They are not the most expressive. They are the least reactive. They do not announce their strength. They demonstrate it through consistency under pressure. This is why these laws do not turn you cruel. They turn you clear. Clear about when silence means evaluation. Clear about when explanation is unnecessary. Clear about when validation is a trap. Clear about when flexibility becomes surrender. Clarity restores choice, and choice restores dignity. The ruthless laws that destroy the weakest parts of your mind cannot be escaped, but they can be understood. And once understood, they lose their ability to surprise you. They become predictable. And when a law becomes predictable, it stops feeling like fate and starts feeling like information. Information you can live with. This documentary does not promise power, it promises orientation. In a world that rarely explains its rules, orientation is the most valuable form of protection. Strength, in the end, is not about hardening yourself against the world. It is about closing the leaks inside your own mind. Because the moment you do, these laws stop destroying you and start working in your favor.